problem. Just take a look in the window. You see them, all good. Rolex, every single reference released on display in the window. Chopard, JLC, Chapek, whatever, all on display. Guess who had no watches on display?
Oh, I have no idea. I'm sure they all did.
Yeah, AP.
From Geneva, Switzerland, this is Open Work, a look inside the watch industry, a podcast from Collective Horology. I'm Gabe Riley, co-founder of Collective.
And I'm Asher Apkin, co-founder of Collective Horology. Boy, we haven't slept much, have we?
No. And I'll tell you what, Collective Horology is an independent watch retailer. We're in Geneva, but actually we're based in Southern California. We carry a wide range of independent brands, including many of the brands exhibiting this week here in Geneva. Of course, to learn more about us and over a dozen independent brands, visit collectivehorology.com. Well, yes, we are sleep deprived, we are jet lagged, and we are punchy with watches. How many watches do you think we have seen in the last couple of days?
Many.
Too many?
Oh, is there such a thing?
Yeah, this hobby, this business for us, this vocation,
this calling,
this avocation knows no depths. We're in too deep, and we'll keep falling down the well. But this is an interesting week to be here. This is our fourth or fifth time out in Geneva for Watches and Wonders? And
I think it might be six.
Attendant events, and you were here years ago for the SIHH, a salon of sorts. And I think what we're hearing from people on the internet is very much what we're experiencing here on the ground, which is, I think there's a lot of discussion among collectors and what I'm seeing online that they're kind of let down or almost disappointed or bored by all the novelties this year, particularly the ones at Watches and Wonders, and with some notable exceptions. And we'll do our favorite unsung watches of the week, because there are plenty, though not many of them were ones we saw in the Palexpo.
One was.
Yeah, there's an exception to every rule. There are a couple that we saw in the Palexpo that were awesome, but I think by and large, that sentiment is shared by the folks on the ground here. There's a feeling, I think there's a couple of feelings about what's going on at Watches and Wonders proper and in the Palexpo, but I think the sentiment here is people feel a bit underwhelmed by what's on offer this year.
Yeah, I think it's important to separate feelings from some reality on this front. You can't expect that every year is going to be a banger of a year. Certainly if we look at the massive brands that are there, when we look at a Rolex, a Patek, et cetera. Rolex a couple years ago had a lot of saved up ammunition from the COVID years. And I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, released new collections. Last year was the Land Dweller. A year before that was it 1908?
Yeah.
So it's understandable that if you've seen 2 new collections from the behemoth of the watch industry, and then you start seeing,
maybe they need to chill.
Yeah. And I mean,
they did introduce a new collection, or a revamped collection with the Yachtmaster too.
Yeah. And they also did some things they've never done before, like a precious metal OP, et cetera. I don't want to dwell on Rolex, but point being, I think that's a good example, and then when we look, but for us, our meetings there, which we didn't have that many this year. Like, we were only at the show, the actual,
for a few hours,
just a few hours. Every other meeting that we have is in downtown Geneva, which is fine, because the truth of the matter is, schlepping out to the Palexpo, for those who don't know, the Palexpo is this gigantic convention center where the Watches and Wonders show is. It's also adjacent to the Villa Sarasan. Sarasan, is that it? Villa Sarasan?
I have no idea.
It's also adjacent to the space where
Time to
Watches is
we learned that we do actually have to go back out there tomorrow for Time to Watches.
Yeah.
But we learned that the proper pronunciation of Time to Watches is Time to Watches.
Yeah, exactly. But anyway, the point I was making is, it's a massive space, and it's quite far away from downtown Geneva. Not literally, but
Well, it's next to the airport, so
exactly.
You can imagine the airport isn't exactly in the center of downtown Geneva.
So it's a schlep. So, I don't mind not having to go back day after day. But I will tell you, having been there now for several years, attendance this year did feel a little lighter than we are used to seeing.
Usually it's packed shoulder to shoulder in there. we were there. Granted, we weren't there on Tuesday, which was sort of the first day of the show. We usually
which is usually the busiest day from a business standpoint.
Yeah, we usually go on Wednesday is our first day there, but the crowd was pretty thin yesterday, and we did talk to a number of people who were there on Tuesday morning even, who told us they felt for a Tuesday the crowd was relatively thin.
Yeah, so there's that. Now again, that's anecdotal. I don't know how true that is.
There could be more people there this year than last. We don't know.
Or 2 hours after we left. I mean, who knows?
Exactly.
But we did have a little bit of time to walk the floor, and there were a few things that I noticed walking around there. One, and I want to start just on a positive note for the show itself. It is a monumentally expensive and incredible endeavor and a construction that the team builds, and I do have to tip my hat to them because they clearly have done a lot of work to continually make it a comfortable show for people to work at. Because the thing is, it as beautiful as the space is, it is exhausting, and I can see that they're doing that. So respect to the show runners who build that every year. So we mentioned this in the past, but they changed the way one enters the venue a couple of years ago. Now you enter primarily through this hall, which is dominated by a sort of secondary quasi-independent area.
Yeah, it's an upstairs area from the main floor. It's almost the loft, if you will.
Yeah,
for the show floor.
And there's a separate sort of a restaurant of sorts for executives there.
Auditorium is there now.
Yeah, there's also a second area where a lot of other independents are. So like Nomos is up there, for example, Cross Studio, etc. But across from that area are two brands that I think are worth talking about for a moment. One is Bremont, I think anyone who's listened to this podcast knows our thoughts on the state of that current business. I mean, we've done several episodes on Bremont. Suffice to say, some of their novelties this year, certainly the one that they're hyping is it's
they continue to be lost in the wilderness. Now, I will say our friend Zach Kazan, who we trust and who is a very honest and straightforward person, he does not hold punches, was actually quite effusive of that Bremont chronograph, having gone hands-on with it, which we did.
We did not. And in fairness, even some of the watches that we loved the most looked better in person. Like one watch we saw today.
Sure.
Like one watch we really admire, the Singer Caballero in titanium, killer watch, even better in person. Yeah. So, if we apply, we can't apply the logic to one another.
Maybe that Bremont really is great. So Bremont is up there.
I don't know if I'm going to go that far, but it might just be better than it looks.
Might be better in person, or
but the other thing
about it we don't understand.
The other thing that I saw that, sometimes companies, you can't stop a company from just being themselves. And I don't know if it's a lack of self-awareness or a true commitment to self-awareness that resulted in this, but we were very curious to see what Audemars Piguet would do at this show.
And they're up there on that same floor.
They were.
With Bremont.
Everybody has to walk by them. And wow, it was really quite a thing to witness. So in a truly remarkable demonstration of, I guess, what everybody expected, while their press release said we're here to be part of the watch community, to share our incredible heritage,
open our doors
quite
to
literally,
the industry and the community.
It was one of the only two booths in the entirety of Watches and Wonders with a gate. And not only a gate, but a gigantic structure that blocked the entire interior of the booth, making it absolutely impossible. It was also, I don't know if you noticed this.
Well, let's back up 1 second.
Well, hang on. I want to finish this
Before you get to AP, I just want to set the stage here. You have to enter through plenty of lines and security and metal detectors and badge searches and credential checks and things like that. So anyone who's entered the space and walked up to the AP booth has already been through several queues, safety checks, and credential checks.
Yeah, there's literally armed guards hidden to protect the probably billions of dollars of assets in that space.
And therefore, when you get to most other booths, Bremont would be example, the first booth you pass by, you can just walk right in.
Now, that doesn't mean that you can hang out in there or you could be there without a meeting, but there's nothing preventing you from entering the space. And notably, every single booth, but for AP, had watches behind glass on display. So if you're just walking the floor, even, we don't have a meeting with Longa this year. Curious to see the 36 millimeter, Saxonia or annual calendars? No problem. Just take a look in the window. You see them, all good. Rolex, every single reference released on display in the window. Chopard, JLC, Chapek, whatever, all on display. Guess who had no watches on display?
Oh, I have no idea. I'm sure they all did.
Yeah, AP.
Yeah.
And what else did AP have, Gabe?
Well, AP had a few things when you walk up to the booth. One was their own queuing system, which no other brand has. Pretty much any other booth you walk up to, you can sort of walk in now to like a foyer or lobby reception
and you're greeted
area.
by somebody.
You're greeted. AP, you have to get in a line, like a queuing system, almost like going to a nightclub or like a Cartier.
There was literally a line for like those who have been
and,
invited and those who have not.
Yeah. And then you have to have your own credentials or badge that they scan to let you in.
Separate AP credential.
And a separate AP credential. And by the way, the entire booth is completely walled off. You can see the exterior, which was done and decorated like some house. I'm assuming it's their manufacturer or something. That was was the decoration on the outside, but you can't. There's nothing to see into. It's literally gate kept, and every other brand at least has some, if not Van Cleef and Arpels, where you can walk in and tour sort of a museum and a gallery space within their booth.
Ulysse Nardin, which had a full
most
display,
other brands, with a couple of exceptions. I think Patek is the other exception. You can just sort of walk in and stroll around, or get some
Patek
sense
is
of what's
literally
going on.
a glass box
Like
you can
Patek
see into.
You can see into it. AP is literally and figuratively completely walled off.
So,
very fitting.
Extremely fitting, and I have to admit, I found it really, really obnoxious. I just did. Because, this is an event for the industry, primarily, to come together for authorized dealers to literally spend millions of dollars for colleagues to look at the work of other people.
Yeah, that's true. It is, in that way, it's a smack in the face to their colleagues in the industry.
It was, I have to say, it was really obnoxious. And I don't know if that was their intention. I doubt it. I'm sure that there was something about it, but
it's like, why even bother if you're going to be there but not be there?
I found it to be extremely off-putting.
Yeah.
And it's not that I expected to be able to walk, but for context, by the way, the last time AP was there was in 2019, which is
at
my
SIHH,
which is my first year attending the show.
What was that set up like?
Very different. So AP was in the center of the hall. The hall was smaller in 2019. They expanded it when they added that loft space you mentioned. And AP was in the center, and the booth was open. You could walk in. It was the year that they announced the code 1159, and you could walk in, you could look at the pieces. They were on display. They were very communicative about the whole logic of the 1159 and the rest of it. And if you remember, there was a big kerfuffle when that watch came out,
Yeah.
But
that was SIHH, right? Because that came out at the beginning of the year, January.
But
right.
there was no gatekeeping there. It was just like any other collegial booth. You could go in, you could look around, you could talk to people. There were educated watchmakers there who would talk to you about the complex case geometry, for example, of the code 1159. Here, they might as well have been selling scarves or tabletop, or who the heck knows what was going on behind those doors. And not that it's their responsibility per se to make their business everybody else's, but the fact that they were the only brand that could not be bothered to put their watches out for their colleagues, the fact that they were the only brand that felt that they needed a queuing system, the fact that they were the only brand that blocked off every component of what they were doing.
Yeah, and I guess I don't want to beat a dead horse here, but you could argue, oh, well, makes sense. There's a lot of demand. They don't really have much to offer, but all the more reason to, if your booth isn't a functioning business space where retailers are coming in and taking meetings and all this kind of stuff, which most booths are, that's why they're there.
Yeah. At great cost.
You'd argue, okay, well, if you're going to be there and you don't really have anything to sell, at least have stuff to show.
Yeah. So anyway, message received.
Yeah.
We as an industry are not welcome.
Yeah.
Understood.
So I did think walking around, there were a few other things that really struck me. One is, although the foot traffic, at least to us, felt a bit lighter, I did notice a lot of brands had reinvested in their booths. So most of the Richemont brands, for instance, so when you go down the stairs to the main hall, from where Bremont AP and Frédéric Constant now has their own booth up there as well. When you go down into the main hall, I did notice, first, one thing stood out right away before we get to Richemont. They're in that Richemont section
Yep.
was just Moser you come down the stairs. Moser is
Yep.
now the first brand you see when you come downstairs. And they're, of course, in the old Mont Blanc booth. We've talked a bit about why Moser is there. What's interesting to me about Mont Blanc not being there in that big booth right across from Vacheron,
Who also, my God,
yeah,
did
beautiful
they
booth.
upgrade their space? Gorgeous.
Yeah, seriously. Mont Blanc announced recently that they're taking the Mont Blanc brand off of Minerva watches, and and now there's a lot to talk about there, but from Mont Blanc backing off of Minerva, which for years they said, we will of course keep the Mont Blanc brand on all Minerva watches. Mont Blanc played this important role, which they deserve credit for, in sort of saving the Minerva brand from what would have otherwise been certain death. They've taken their name off of Minerva watches. They're no longer at Watches and Wonders. One has to wonder if Mont Blanc is slowly walking away from watchmaking. I don't know. Certainly they're walking away from their approach to the industry, but this was the latest thing that made me wonder. We'll see where that goes. But yeah, that Richemont space, most of those brands had converted, a significantly changed and upgraded their booths. IWC has an awesome sort of space exploration theme booth. The Vacheron booth was
IWC had
beautiful.
Also, kudos to IWC this year. I do think there were a lot of model refreshes, but there were some really critical things there that they did that were, crowd pleasers, like being able to roll their perpetual calendar back. That's a huge update. And that beautiful watch that they made, the space watch, was really, I thought,
the Venturer.
The Venturer, thank you. Really, really cool and really interesting. So again,
and they always
respect.
do a good job. I think a lot of these booths are seas of sameness.
Yeah.
There's not that, I know you like Vacheron, but there's not that much different between the Vacheron booth and the Cartier booth and the Jaeger booth and the Bulgari booth.
I do think no, I actually disagree. I think this year
they're variations on a theme. IWC, however, always has a very different approach.
You know what? Actually, I see what you're saying, in the sense that the Bulgari booth, which was, by the way,
another
stunner, looked like the modern interpretation of the Bulgari boutiques, as did the Vacheron boutique, as does the Cartier boutique.
Yeah, it feels very old, and they feel like the brand, theme, old luxury. And then you have IWC, who's very confident in being themselves and doing something that is very arresting and very different.
Yeah, that's true.
From all the other brands. So kudos to them. But it was clear that the brands obviously spend millions and millions and millions of dollars each to be there. The big brands do, and to execute. That they, even in a market that is going through a lot of challenges, are continuing to invest. It would have been easy, given everything we know about what's happening in the industry, how brutal 2025 was. It would have been easy for the brands to stretch their booths, which are all perfectly nice,
for sure,
one more year. And instead, what we saw was a commitment, and essentially this is a recommitment from these brands to the show, because they'll essentially keep that same booth in place for at least 2 years. So IWC tends to use the same booth for about 2 years in a row. Most of the other brands will stick with that theme for 2-3 years or longer, and then they'll refresh them. So what this tells us is that all of these brands are recommitting to the show and upping their investment in the show, despite what's going on in the industry overall, which is great to see.
Yeah, I want to talk about Moser for a second, because we asked a question of ourselves about 6 weeks ago, when we talked about Moser making a very significant deal out of moving from the Carré to the space that they're in now. And look, the watch that they really built the show around was this collaboration with Reebok, the pump. And while
I like it on the basis of pure nostalgia.
Yeah, so that's the thing. What I was gonna say is the watch to me is it's fine. I'm not personally all that psyched about it, but I have to tip my cap to them, because there is still a very sort of roguish element to being directly across from Alanga and Zone, who of course are kings of high watchmaking, and then you're like, hey, check out my sneaker collab, and to a degree, it does make me feel like, while Moser is evolving its business, scaling its operations, aiming to be a much larger corporation than they are today, it does appear that they do want to do that with their personality intact.
Yeah.
So
they're maintaining their sense of humor, which is good to see.
Totally, because they could absolutely have decided to put like a cylindrical tourbillon or one of their other more like high complication pieces as a centerpiece there. Opposite Vacheron and opposite Lange, and they didn't. They put something that was a personality piece up. So respect to Edouard and the team over there for holding that down. That I saw, I really respect that. So kudos to them.
Hey, it's Gabe. Openwork is proudly ad-free and requires no paid subscription. If you'd like to support the show, please take a moment to subscribe, rate, and review on your podcast platform of choice. Please also check out and subscribe to Collective Horology on YouTube, where you'll find hundreds of videos we've made on independent watchmaking. You can find our channel at collectivehorology.com/YouTube. And of course, you can always support the podcast by picking up a watch from over a dozen independent brands, along with our latest merch at collectivehorology.com. Thanks for listening and for your support. Now back to the show.
Then you get to the Carré. And one thing that's interesting about the Carré, which is where all the independents are, there are two things that really stood out to me there. One, it's significantly larger than it has historically been. Last year, I believe, was the first year it moved to behind the Rolex booth.
Yeah.
It got bigger then, but if you recall, it was sort of subdivided. And this year they didn't divide it. It's just one long,
big space.
Yeah. And it really, I think, was also sort of an indication of the growth of independents in general. Obviously, we'll talk more about this, but like most of the independents, not all, but the majority are spread around downtown now by volume. But like within the show, those that were attending, it did feel like a much larger space and a bigger presence, including something that both you and I were surprised to see and didn't realize was there, which was Credor.
Yeah. Credor has their own booth.
Yeah, and we were. I mean, look, we're huge Credor fans. We're both Gabe and I really love the Ichi-2. Some of their new releases this year are absolutely gorgeous, and obviously the watchmaking is at the highest level from Japan. And we started asking around does anybody know, not to put too fine a point on it, but why they're here? Because that's a really interesting question. Are they looking to be placed in independent boutiques?
Or why is this not within the Grand Seiko?
Exactly.
booth?
So, we're getting some interesting answers about that. I don't know that we have like something I would consider definitive, but what I think is pretty clear from that investment is that they do want to grow Credor, whether that's within existing GS retailers, whether that's as a separate brand and domestically. That's not entirely clear, but what is absolutely clear is that Seiko as a corporation is looking to grow the presence and the gravitas of their of that horology brand within their catalog.
And I think if you're Seiko and you look at, say, what Citizen is doing, which is, they've got haute horology brands as well in Arnold & Son and Angelus.
Yeah.
I can see how, and they compete among the independents essentially.
Yeah, they're even really, I think, doing some pretty significant marketing work on the high end of Citizen itself.
Yeah. I can see why the Seiko Corporation may look at that and say, okay, Seiko is obviously a bulwark of the industry. You've got Grand Seiko now. We talked about on our last podcast. They've established that as a really premium and prestigious brand. Hey, maybe we can go after an entirely new segment of the market in a more significant and focused way by treating Credor as its own brand. And I guess from their perspective, competing against the high end of the indies. Now, again, we don't know. I was shocked when I saw Credor then. I would assume they were on the map beforehand, but it was just they're right on the corner on the end. And so it's one of the first things you see, and it was stunning to me. But it put a smile on my face. I was
thrilled to see it.
Seeing those watches presented in a really focused way.
So, if we zoom out, the show continues as it always has. We have some newcomers, some with open doors, some with not. And interestingly, a lot of the heartbeat of what, and I realize we're biased because we only sell independent watches, but for us, we really feel like the heartbeat of this week in Geneva, as the Geneva Watch Week in August and September was downtown. And there's a lot going on across Geneva. There's multiple shows. We have, of course, the return of the AHCI, one of our favorite events, which is only about a couple hundred feet from where we're sitting right now. The Beau Rivage is from top to bottom, 5 floors of independent watches.
Block with watch brands.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's a new show, Chronopolis, We have, of course, time to watches.
Time to watches.
And then
time to watches.
Exactly. And then we have, folks who are camped out at their own buildings, the Madhouse for MB&F, the awesome Urwerk Atelier for Urwerk.
We have brands that also took a totally different approach. We had a wonderful meeting this morning with the folks at Berneron.
Oh, yeah.
And they rented out in the Old Town an art gallery, which was, it's not their own space, but it couldn't have been better. It was the perfect environment.
Yeah, the vibe at that
cool.
Space was super awesome. And it was, we had Sylvain on the pod a few months ago. He left a really strong impression on us. His watches, I'd had the pleasure of seeing in a first edition A series Mirage off the wrist of our dear friend Alon Ben Joseph about a year ago, give or take. Awesome watch. We got to go hands-on with the Quantième, which in a working prototype, which was fabulous. And Sylvain was kind enough to take us through the inner workings
Save
of
it
that.
for the watch debrief podcast.
I will, but okay, fair. But if we take a step back, a lot of these meetings are stressful and exhausting. Lots of people around, rooms are hot, lots of background noise.
You're meeting with someone, and the next meeting enters the room and is standing there waiting for you to finish.
Yeah, exactly. People are constantly trying to say hi. It's all sorts of stuff. That was a calming and peaceful space.
It was the antidote. Yeah, no, it was very clever. It was a great environment in which to show watches, to do it in an art gallery, especially for Berneron, made all sorts of sense. But to have a place that was more self-selecting, wasn't overrun with people, where you could take your time, that wasn't crowded, that had proper air conditioning, all that sort of stuff. It was, I think, the best meeting from the perspective of the environment. It felt good.
Yeah.
So hat tip to them. I'd like to see more brands do things like that, not necessarily all crowd together in a hotel suite or at a trade show, but to find some space around Geneva. And it was convenient and walking distance to so many other things. Find a nice space.
Well, what's interesting
to be
about
able
that,
to have a more relaxed discussion about watches.
As I think about it, when listening to you say it, I think part of it is also tied to the expectation of who is coming to these meetings. Berneron does not have ADs. We went just because we admire the brand and we wanted to go hands-on with the full line, not for any purpose beyond that. And the reason Sylvain and his team are camped out there is primarily for direct-to-consumer consultation and sale, which is a different vibe than B2B sales, and I think that probably contributes to it to a certain degree. Trade shows are whatever industry you're in, a trade show feels like a trade show. And I think people are just used to doing business that way. And it's interesting to me to find folks that are willing to go against the grain on it. I hope that, should Berneron ever decide that the brand is going to work with third-party partners, that they keep that vibe.
Yeah.
It was great energy.
Absolutely. So we've got brands everywhere. And what was surprising to me is, I think the Beau Rivage is a good example of this. It's been the very opposite of what we saw at the Palexpo, in the sense of, I think you're seeing at a place like the Beau Rivage some of the most exciting watches that are on offer at Geneva Watch Week, or the Week of Watches and Wonders in Geneva.
Yeah.
And it is chock-a-block, not just with brands, but
it's your second chock-a-block.
But not just with brands. It's not only filled first floor literally to the roof with watch brands, but filled with people. I mean, there is hustle and bustle in there. It feels like it's where the action is now. It may help that the halls of the hotel are much more sort of claustrophobic than the wide open halls of the Palexpo. But there's an energy and a vitality in a space like the Beau Rivage. I'm really curious. Tomorrow we'll not only go to Time to Watches, but we'll go to Chronopolis as well, which is taking, again, it's a fair in the sense that they've organized a bunch of brands together, but they're taking their own approach to it. I listened to them, I'm not sure if you did, on Hodinkee Radio on Business of Watches with Andy Hoffman, and they talked about their approach is much more casual. They have a bar there. It's a space to hang out. So it seems much more like a watch meetup than a watch fair. And I think all of this to say is, what I'm starting to see in Geneva is a shift. In the first few years we were doing this, truly the center of gravity was the Palexpo.
Yep.
It now feels to me like the center of gravity is downtown Geneva.
So I would agree, but I also recognize that we don't retail mainstream brands. And I think if you and I sold Rolex or Patek or Chopard or something like that,
or any number of brands, we'd be at the Palexpo all week and we'd never think to come downtown.
Yeah.
However, what I would say is this, maybe it hasn't shifted, but it's shifting. A few years ago, really the only sort of counter programming to Watches and Wonders when we first started doing
the Beau Rivage, and the HCI.
Yeah, but talk about like niche.
But that was fringy, yeah,
and fringy. Now you have the Beau Rivage, even more. It was the first few years. It was like the first couple floors of the hotel had brands. We had friends years ago. One of our friends was staying in a hotel room in the Beau Rivage during Watches and Wonders.
Oh, that's right. Yeah,
that's not possible anymore. The entire hotel is rented out by watch brands.
Yeah.
There are no suites or rooms available for people. So now the Beau Rivage is filled up completely, and then you have Time to Watches, you have Chronopolis, you have brands who are opening their doors around town. You have other hotels that are hosting brands. We did meetings at the Ritz. I mean, we've been all over town here in a way that just wasn't possible even a few years ago. So you're right. In, the law of large numbers here favors Watches and Wonders and the Palexpo. That's where the big brands who are doing most of the business, most of the volume, most of the revenue in the industry are still there. And you're right, you could be a hardcore watch industry insider, whether you're a journalist or a retailer, and just spend all week at the Palexpo, and that's great.
Mm-hmm.
However, there are now more and more and more options and more brands outside of the Palexpo in a way that just didn't exist a few years ago, and is continuing to gather steam.
Yeah, it's also going to be fascinating. So I agree with that. I think the measure for me will be a couple things. One, is the magnetic pull of these other shows strong enough to attract mainstream retailers? For the right reasons, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we know that margins are getting tighter in mainstream retail. They may look for, practical reasons at independents. They may also look at them for the same reasons that we do, which is, the wellspring of creativity that drives independence. So I'm curious to see that. The other indicator will be how much bigger and how much more growth we see at Geneva Watch Days in September. Because Geneva Watch Days is predominantly independent.
Yeah.
And that show has grown year over year over year. And I'm curious to see if it will continue that fairly aggressive trajectory. And I feel pretty comfortable hypothesizing that it will, based on what we've seen here.
Now, speaking of Geneva Watch Days, one of the brands at the center of Geneva Watch Days is Breitling. They do not officially participate in Watches and Wonders. They are doing some counter programming here in Geneva. I've heard a number of retailers say they had Breitling meetings. I'm not sure where they're showing.
So Breitling traditionally has done some sort of, large event immediately preceding the show.
But they didn't do that this year. They're doing counter programming in Geneva. So there's some Breitling presence in Geneva. I've seen people walking around.
Is that tied to Universal Genève, or is that?
I have no idea. Oh, we should talk about Universal Genève. But they're here in some sort of renegade rogue capacity and meeting with retailers and maybe media.
Interesting.
But Swatch Group is not.
No, it hasn't been doing. I mean, remember Swatch Group had their own counter programmed show?
Yeah.
I think, was it 3 or 4 years ago?
Yeah, and it was on. They literally drove everyone around from one brand to the next around Switzerland.
But they're pretty quiet.
They're not participating at all. I don't think they participate, or their brands participate in Geneva Watch Days, from what I can recall. So
no,
I think that they're sticking out like a sore thumb, and you have to wonder, with all of the challenges that Swatch Group is navigating, if this is something that they want to reconsider. We'll see.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, personally, I would love to see some Omega action here during this period of time. I would love to see some Piguet action here during this period of time. It's interesting because, and this goes, I think, to my point earlier about why the AP thing got under my skin so much. it's not about whether you're doing business with some of these brands. It's about really being able to understand what everybody's doing, what makes them interesting, not even just from a competitive standpoint, but just because we're all part of this business. And I want to know, I want to see it, It's important for everyone in the business to understand what everybody is doing and what makes them special.
Yeah.
And the other thing about it, and I think this is key too, it's the conversations you have when you bump into people from other brands, and you just sort of you can wrap your head around what they're doing, even if it's not necessarily
Sure. Or
your
just
speed.
even be able to your point, just to be able to see a watch and change your mind about it.
Sure.
And so I think it's a huge missed opportunity. Swatch has just decided, hey, we're not doing this. We're not going to be here. And we can debate whether that's the right thing for them to do or the wrong thing to do. I think it's a bit misguided from the perspective that for most people, whether you're an enthusiast, whether you're a retailer, whether you're a journalist, or you work in some other capacity in the watch industry around the world, there's really only one, maybe 2 times a year that you come to Switzerland. And that's for Watches and Wonders and maybe Geneva Watch Days. That's it. It's a lot of time, effort, energy, money, resources to come out here and to do this. For most people, you're away from your family, you're spending thousands on accommodations and travel.
Sure.
You're stepping away from your business. It's a challenge for us. Thankfully, we have a team now back in California who can run the business while we're not here. But for the first few years, that wasn't
shout
the
out
case.
to Jeff, Ellie, and Jimmy for that.
Absolutely. And we basically used to have to put our business entirely on hold for a week to come out here and do this. And so when you decide not to participate like Swatch has done, which maybe they have their own reasons and who knows, you're kind of missing out on that opportunity, and it's not great because when else are, all these folks going to be out here? For AP, I think it's particularly misguided to show up and then put a velvet rope in front of what you do because,
well, you know what? Yeah. I mean, I was also just thinking about that occurred to me. It's actually, maybe it's more telling than we think it is about what their priorities are, come to think of it. Not to get back to that, but it just occurred to me. By not putting any watches out and putting that gigantic wall up, what they're telling us is that they care much more about their brand than they do their product. That's the message I'm taking away from that, because their brand at this point is standoffish and designed to keep you out and is, among other things. And the product is kind of like the reward for running the gauntlet of it, as opposed to the reason for existence and being built around it. And that structure really, really tells us something about it. You know what I mean? Like, because most watch brands, the first thing they want to do is put their watch on your wrist to tell you about it.
Yeah.
And they set it up in a way not to. So anyway, putting them aside, because enough, exhaust fumes directed in their
I guess my
direction.
point is, if you're going to make the effort to be here, if you're going to make the investment, if people around the world are coming to see your stuff, at least give them something to look at, because
and participate in the community. Participate in the community.
Nothing changes minds like going hands-on with a watch or being able to see a watch in the metal and appreciate something about it that you couldn't through photos or videos.
Well, it also helps you understand those that are passionate about a brand. Like, I'll give you an example. A brand that I've always been curious about, but that I didn't quite intellectually understand, was Beauvais. And, Beauvais' watch that at the GPHG last year, I thought was
the world timer that accounted for the half-hour time.
Yeah, it's so cool. But I've always sort of like not. I have personally.
It was a daylight savings.
Yes,
time.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
But my point is, I've always sort of struggled to understand the aesthetic of the brand, even if the watchmaking I know is exceptional.
Mm-hmm.
But I've had opportunities to meet people from Beauvais over the years here, and it's helped me understand the brand. And that doesn't mean that like it's a brand that Gabe and I are like trying to open for collective, or is even a brand that we, are pursuing in any meaningful way. But what it helps us do is understand when a client, says, I enjoy Beauvais, or talks about Beauvais in general, I now have a much better understanding of what the brand is trying to do, what their reason for existence is, a little bit about their heritage, and a little bit of an understanding of the product lines, which helps me understand a client and their collecting and their interest and Beauvais. And to me, that's pretty cool. I mean, there are brands that we meet with all the time or that I talk to. Like yesterday, for example, I had the pleasure of meeting Christian Lass, incredible watchmaker. I was introduced to him by Tim Jackson years ago. Tim was kind enough to introduce me in person yesterday. Not somebody that we're trying to open or pursue, but I'm so grateful that I got to meet, and for no reason. I mean, he's just sold out forever. But the reason I bring that up is having the opportunity to be introduced to him, to spend some time with him, to handle his watches, helps me understand that work, and that is so incredibly valuable. It's so critical. And same thing with like Hajime Asoaka. It's very difficult to see any of his watches. There's so few. It's not about the retail side of it. It's about the understanding of it. It's about the collegial nature. So all of this to say, what I think we are seeing right now is just if we zoom all the way out, this industry is in a state of change. Where that's going to go, that's anybody's guess. We know some brands are considering changing hands. Baume & Mercier was sold. The rumors about JLC. There's rumors about Zenith. Like all of these things. On top of that, the growth of these secondary shows, the magnetic pull of independence, the feeling that the heartbeat might be moving from one. Maybe it hasn't. Maybe it's only moving by one standard deviation. Mm-hmm. But there is definitely a change. There is a pivot, and it is exciting to see, not because I know where it's going to go, but because this industry, in the time that we've been in it, we've learned that evolution is very incremental and very slow, but it does in the last 5 years feel accelerated.
Far from static.
Yeah. So, we're in a state of flux. So for people who look at this and they say like, oh, I wish that there was more of this or more of that. Fair enough. But I think it's important to look at it also in the business context of, we're in a state of business transition. Different brands are evolving in what they do, how they present, how they show up, where they present, and their relevancy. And where that's going to land will play out over the next 5-10 years. But it's definitely changing.
Yeah.
And you can feel it.
Yeah, that's true. I think the other interesting thing someone brought up to us last night, we were hanging out with Logan Baker.
Oh, yeah.
He's now running marketing at Ming, but of course he's maybe mostly known for his time at Hodinkee and as a watch journalist. But what he was saying, we were talking a lot to him about the show and the evolution of the show, because of course he saw it in his years covering the watch industry as a journalist. He went to all of these shows, including to Basel World, and he was saying, one of the things people complained about with Basel World, obviously, was this idea that they felt like they were getting fleeced by the city of Basel. And that you'd come in, the show would come in for the week, and all the prices of the hotel rooms would double. And restaurants all of a sudden had dynamic pricing and were raising their pricing and all of this sort of stuff. And he was saying, that seems to be what's happening now with Geneva. And of course, one of the big reasons the brands moved to Watches and Wonders and to Geneva was because there was apparently some promise from the city of Geneva that, that sort of thing wouldn't happen here, because of course this is the cradle of watchmaking and we appreciate the community and we want to welcome the world here to Geneva, and we would never do such a thing. But of course, look at look at hotel rates in Geneva this week, and look, businesses price based on supply and demand. Hotels have always priced based on supply and demand. But I think the question is now Geneva becoming Basel, in that people are feeling maybe they're taken advantage of, and it's getting more and more expensive to come here and to exhibit here. So that is another element too. I mean, we see this time in Geneva becoming more and more relevant, more brands participating here and being here in one way or another. And at the same time, we're hearing it's expensive.
Yeah.
Not just to get a hotel room to stay in, but to get a space to exhibit in. So that's a pressure coming from the other direction.
Yeah.
And I'm curious to see how that impacts this week in Geneva over time as well. Is that sustainable, or does that become a pressure and a reason, or maybe an impetus for brands, retailers, journalists, collectors to start looking at other ways to see watches and to spend time here? Who knows?
Yeah.
All right. Well, we will be back in just a couple days. Before we get out of here, we'll record because we still have more watches to see. We're only halfway through this thing.
Man.
We have the rest of today, and we've got tomorrow, all day tomorrow, to go hands-on with more watches to check out more stuff. So after we're done with all of that, we'll be back with our favorite watches of the week, and we can't wait to bring that to you. In the meantime, thank you for listening. This, of course, is Open Work. It's a production of Collective Horology. You can find us online at collectivehorology.com. And please do get in touch with questions, feedback, and suggestions. We'd love to get that stuff from you guys. And to do that, just email us at podcast@collectivehorology.com.
Sarah San.